Thank you, Ray, and can I also begin by acknowledging traditional owners on whose land we meet today and pay my respects to elders past and present. Can I also extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are here with us this morning. I'd also like to apologise for the Prime Minister who has been unable to join us. She did want to join us this morning, but she has been delayed. I understand she's going to catch up with Andrew and Warren Mundine a bit later on today. Tony Abbott, Leader of the Opposition, my ministerial colleague Jenny Macklin, the Minister for Indigenous Affairs, and far too many parliamentary colleagues to name individually, and I won't attempt it because I'll probably miss somebody out, but it is wonderful to see the parliamentary support that we have here today. Leah Armstrong, I understand from Reconciliation Australia, is here, and of course Andrew Forrest and Warren Mundine, who we've just heard from. But importantly, all the employers in the room and those organisations which are employing Indigenous Australians right around the country today. Of course, today is GenerationOne and this Employment Covenant's third birthday. It is something worth celebrating. Since the Employment Covenant was founded by Andrew Forrest in 2008, it has indeed surpassed its target of 50,000 jobs for Indigenous Australians. As Andrew said, 335 employers have committed more than 60,000 jobs. And GenerationOne reports that more than 14,200 Indigenous Australians have taken up these jobs. The Australian Government has signed up with the Employment Covenant in 2009, and we provided support for what has been a productive partnership. I really do want to congratulate all those employers in the room who have been part of that. I know that as Minister for Indigenous Employment and Economic Development, I want to thank GenerationOne and the Employment Covenant and those employers who've worked so hard and their efforts into tapping into the employment demand for Indigenous employees and to help close the gap. As you know, the Australian Government pledged in 2008 to halve the gap in employment between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians, aged 15 to 64, by 2018. It remains one of our most important and one of our most ambitious targets, and it should be ambitious. Employment is one of the vital indicators of progress in our reconciliation progression with Australia's First Peoples. Each job brings opportunity to the individual, to their family and to their communities. We all know that supporting participation of Indigenous Australians in the workforce and in business is an integral part of meeting our important employment target. In addition to the achievements of GenerationOne, Reconciliation Australia reports now that 1.7 million Australians are working for an organisation with a reconciliation action plan. Just on Monday, Crown Casino's James Packer launched Crown's Reconciliation Action Plan and committed to creating 2,000 Indigenous jobs by 2021. Ensuring that this demand from employers translates into sustainable jobs for Indigenous Australians is really critical. Crown, for instance, is one of many employers to receive funding from the Australian Government to create jobs for Indigenous Australians. Indeed, the Government has provided $73 million in 91 contracts to employers such as the ANZ Bank, BHP Billiton, Coles, the Compass Group, Crown Casinos, Fortescue Metals, Group Training Australia, Linfox, McMahon, Rio Tinto, Transfield Services and indeed Woodside. The Australian Government will continue to meet our commitment by providing direct assistance to many employers who have signed up to the Covenant and by providing Indigenous job seekers with the pre-vocational training and other support to help them take up the jobs that are available under the Employment Covenant. Indeed, since 1 July 2009, we've allocated more than $150 million to Covenant employers directly through the Indigenous Employment Program. We've also provided support to the AEC directly of over $7 million since 2009 to support the 46,000 job commitments. Throughout this process, we've worked closely with GenerationOne and will continue to work closely with GenerationOne and of course with employers to meet this commitment to halve the gap of Indigenous employment outcomes by 2018. I've had the opportunity as Minister to meet with many employers and many Indigenous businesses. Regular discussions with employers are critical to ensuring we can develop opportunities for Indigenous Australians to be employed. I've visited many parts of Australia, such as Bourke, the far north Queensland, the Pilbara, to see firsthand how things work, particularly in remote Australia. I want today to thank Fortescue, Woodside and Rio Tinto for their hospitality and cooperation during my visits. It is a commitment from companies like this which make a real difference to Indigenous employment in remote areas particularly. For example, around 60% of the workers of the 250 Indigenous employees at Rio Tinto, Alcan and Weipa are local Indigenous people. Late last year, I asked the Department of Education, Employment and Workplace Relations to conduct a series of roundtables from December to February to consult with employers operating in remote parts of Australia. I wanted to ensure that the existing employment and training opportunities and new opportunities are captured with the imminent introduction of our Remote Jobs and Communities Plan. As many of you in this room know, from 1 July, the Remote Jobs and Communities Plan will provide a more streamlined and flexible employment and participation service in remote Australia. With funding of $1.5 billion over 5 years, the new program will build on existing services. We're combining Job Services Australia, Disability Employment Services, the Indigenous Employment Program in remote Australia, and the CDEP. We're close to making announcements soon on successful providers in these regions. The next important step, of course, is consultations with local communities and with employers. That will happen very soon. The Indigenous Employment Program is an important component of the government's employment services framework for linking Indigenous Australians to jobs. Since we came to government, the Indigenous Employment Program has now funded 2,914 projects worth $540 million. This morning, I want to reassure everyone present that the government remains committed to the Indigenous Employment Program. This program continues to achieve excellent results. Its flexibility is welcomed by employers, and the employment outcomes for Indigenous people working in partnership with the employers and industries to ensure workplaces are equipped with the skills, the knowledge and the expertise to provide sustainable career pathways for Indigenous Australians, not just an entry-level job. The existing Indigenous Employment Program has achieved more than 100,000 employment and training placements since 2009. To meet the Closing the Gap employment target, the contribution of the IEP needs to be maximised, and the program needs to be delivered to the best possible outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, while responding, of course, to the growing areas of labour market demand. We need to ensure that the ever-expanding pool of employers of all sizes and across all sectors can build and sustain a strong Indigenous workforce at all levels within their organisations. We also need to find ways to better harness and share the innovative models and approaches to Indigenous employment, some of which we've heard today. This includes finding ways to ensure that successful approaches become systematically embedded in businesses as usual practice in the workplaces across the country. The Department of Employment, Education and Workplace Relations will explore with employers and Indigenous businesses and peak organisations how the Indigenous Employment Program could be better administered to ensure that the investment is targeted to areas of greatest need and that opportunity maximises the program's contribution to our Closing the Gap employment target. At the same time, we need to consider how changes to the program's administration could provide greater certainty for stakeholders around Indigenous Employment Program funding decisions and clarify access to the program. The Department will shortly release a discussion paper and commence consultations to seek stakeholder views on these important issues. I look forward to the results of the consultation process and how we can move forward. The work being done by GenerationOne and the Employment Covenant in raising awareness and changing attitudes is making a major contribution to the task of closing the gap of Indigenous disadvantage. The Australian Government stands ready to continue to work with GenerationOne to support linking Indigenous Australians with real jobs and providing the necessary support for job seekers and employers to achieve this. There are many Australians committed to creating more jobs for Indigenous Australians, many of you here today, and to support them and to keep those jobs. Each one of these individuals and the organisations has had their own ideas and methods in working to achieve their aims. GenerationOne is a real leader in this regard, and as such I do talk regularly with Warren, and I look forward to continuing to work with him and all of you in the room into the future. Congratulations again to GenerationOne on turning 3, and thank you for the leadership and encouraging employers to commit to employing Indigenous Australians. The government will stand ready to help. Thank you.